Picture this. You're scrolling through ancient Rome's equivalent of Instagram, and suddenly you see a post that makes your jaw drop. A woman, not an empress, not a senator's wife, but a courtesan, has just publicly humiliated the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire. We're talking about a showdown so scandalous it made Messalina herself look like a Sunday school teacher. This isn't just some petty drama between influencers fighting over brand deals. This is the story of how one forgotten woman brought an empire to its knees, using nothing but wit, audacity, and a level of shamelessness that would make modern reality TV producers weep with joy. Her name has been scrubbed from most history books, but her legend that burned so bright it nearly torched Rome itself. Still think ancient history is boring? Stick around, this rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. And trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Let's set the scene, shall we? Rome, 48 AD. The empire is at its absolute peak. Roads stretching to the ends of the known world, aqueducts that would make modern engineers cry, and enough marble to make every Instagram influencer jealous. But here's what your history teacher conveniently left out. Rome wasn't just built on conquests and engineering marvels. It was built on sex, scandal, and a social hierarchy so twisted it would make a soap opera writer blush. At the top of this glittering cesspool sat Empress Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. Now, Messalina wasn't your typical empress content with hosting dinner parties and dedicating temples. No, she was running what can only be described as the ancient world's most exclusive OnlyFans account. Except instead of subscriptions, she was collecting political favors, and instead of content warnings, people just disappeared. But here's where it gets interesting. In a city where powerful women were expected to be seen and not heard, where even the empress had to play by certain rules, there existed a parallel universe, a shadowy network of women who operated by entirely different laws. These weren't the respectable matrons featured on Roman coins. These were the courtesans, the entertainers, the women who understood that in a world run by men's appetites, appetite itself could be weaponized. Think of it like this. If Rome's official social media was LinkedIn, all professional headshots, and carefully curated achievements, then the courtesan network was Twitter after midnight. Raw, unfiltered, and absolutely lethal when used correctly. Among these women, there was a hierarchy as complex as any corporate org chart. At the bottom were the common prostitutes working the taverns near the Circus Maximus. Above them, the actresses and dancers who performed in the theatres. Then came the higher-class courtesans who entertained wealthy merchants and minor politicians. But, at the very top, there was a tier so exclusive, so dangerous, that even mentioning their names in the wrong company could end your political career. Our story centers on one woman who somehow clawed her way to the absolute pinnacle of this shadow empire. Let's call her Livia, not because that was necessarily her real name, but because most records of her actual identity were mysteriously destroyed in what historians politely call bureaucratic housekeeping, and what anyone with half a brain recognizes as an imperial-level cover-up. Livia wasn't born into this world of silk and secrets. According to the few fragmentary accounts that survived, she started as most did, sold into slavery as a child, probably around 7 or 8 years old. But here's what made her different. While other children in her situation learned to survive by becoming invisible, Livia learned to survive by becoming unforgettable. By age 15, she wasn't just another pretty face in Rome's flesh markets. She had somehow acquired an education that rivaled senators' sons, literature, philosophy, mathematics, even basic legal knowledge. More importantly, she had developed what we might now call emotional intelligence, on a level that bordered on supernatural. She could read a room faster than a political pollster, identify power dynamics quicker than a management consultant, and manipulate social situations with the precision of a chess grandmaster. But here's the thing that really set her apart. Livia understood that in Rome, information was more valuable than gold, more powerful than armies, and more dangerous than poison. While other courtesans focused on beauty and pleasure, Livia focused on secrets. She didn't just entertain Rome's elite, she studied them, catalogued their weaknesses, and built what essentially amounted to the ancient world's most sophisticated intelligence network. The woman who would eventually challenge Messalina herself wasn't playing the same game as everyone else. She wasn't even playing by the same rules. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly does a former slave girl go toe-to-toe with the Empress of Rome? The answer is both simpler and more complex than you'd expect. It starts with understanding something most people miss about ancient Rome. The city wasn't just the political capital of an empire. It was the ancient world's equivalent of Hollywood, Wall Street, and Las Vegas, all rolled into one intoxicating, dangerous package. Imagine if modern-day New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. were all crammed into one city. And then, imagine that city had no real law enforcement, no social media oversight, and no concept of scandal being bad for business. That was Rome, a place where fortunes were made and lost in a single dinner party, where reputation was everything and nothing simultaneously, and where the line between entertainment and politics was so blurred it basically didn't exist. Into this chaos stepped our Livia, around the year 45 AD, now in her early 20s, and operating under a name that was already becoming whispered in the right circles. But she wasn't just another courtesan trying to climb the social ladder. She was something Rome had never seen before. A woman who understood that the real power didn't lie in being desired by powerful men, but in being essential to them. See, most courtesans of her era were basically luxury goods. Beautiful, entertaining, but ultimately replaceable. Livia made herself irreplaceable by becoming something much more dangerous. She became indispensable. While her competitors were perfecting their dance moves and poetry recitations, Livia was building what we'd now recognize as a consulting firm specializing in reputation management, political strategy, and what the Romans euphemistically called social navigation. Her clients weren't just looking for a pretty face to take to dinner parties. They were coming to her for advice on everything from marriage alliances to business deals to military appointments. She had somehow positioned herself as the unofficial advisor to Rome's unofficial power brokers, the men who actually ran the empire while the emperor was busy with his building projects and philosophical debates. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Livia didn't just serve Rome's powerful men, she studied them. Every conversation was intelligence gathering. Every intimate moment was an opportunity to learn about troop movements, financial deals, or political alliances. She was running what essentially amounted to a one-woman CIA operation, except instead of serving a country, she was serving her own carefully calculated agenda. The woman was building something unprecedented, a power base that existed entirely outside traditional Roman social structures. She had no family name to lean on, no inherited wealth, no political position, but she had something more valuable. She had information, and she had the intelligence to use it strategically. By 47 AD, Livia had established what historians would later describe as a salon, though that polite term doesn't quite capture the reality. It was more like a combination intelligence briefing, therapy session, and strategic planning meeting, all wrapped up in the veneer of sophisticated entertainment. Politicians, generals, merchants, even philosophers would gather in her carefully appointed villa on the Palatine Hill to discuss everything from military strategy to philosophical treatises to the latest gossip about their rivals. But here's the thing that made this gathering truly revolutionary. Unlike every other social gathering in Rome, this one wasn't organized around traditional power hierarchies. Senators sat next to merchants, veterans shared wine with philosophers, foreign diplomats debated with Roman citizens. The only rule was intelligence. You had to be interesting, informed, and useful to earn a place at Livia's table. This was radical beyond anything we can imagine today. Roman society was built on rigid class structures that had been in place for centuries. The idea that a former slave girl could create a space where social rank mattered less than intellectual value. It was like someone in medieval Europe opening a coffee shop where peasants and nobles sat at the same tables as equals. And here's the brilliant part. Livia made it work by making it exclusive. She didn't challenge Roman social hierarchy. She simply created an alternative hierarchy based on different rules. You couldn't buy your way into her circle with money or blood lineage. You had to earn it with wit, information, and strategic value. The result? By 48 AD, Livia's villa had become what we might now call an unofficial ministry of intelligence, strategy, and social coordination. And that's when she made the decision that would change everything. She decided it was time to test her network against the ultimate challenge. She decided to go after Messalina. Let's pause for a moment and talk about Valeria Messalina, because understanding her is crucial to understanding why what happened next was so absolutely unprecedented. If Livia was building her power through intelligence and strategy, Messalina wielded hers through what can only be described as weaponized shamelessness. Picture the most dramatic person you know, the one who turns every minor inconvenience into a three-act tragedy, who somehow makes their lunch order sound like a declaration of war. Now imagine that person has unlimited wealth, absolute legal immunity, and the military backing of the Roman Empire. That was Messalina on a Tuesday. Born into one of Rome's most prestigious patrician families, Messalina had been groomed from childhood to understand that rules were for other people. By the time she married Claudius and became empress in 38 AD, she had already developed what modern psychologists might recognize as a masterclass in narcissistic personality disorder, except with the resources to make her delusions reality. But here's what made Messalina truly dangerous. She was intelligent enough to understand the game she was playing, but reckless enough not to care about the consequences. Where other empresses might use their position to gain political influence or secure their family's future, Messalina used hers like a teenager with their parents' credit card and no supervision. Her legendary sexual appetite wasn't just personal indulgence, it was political strategy. In a society where a woman's virtue was supposed to be her most valuable asset, Messalina turned promiscuity into a form of soft power. She collected lovers like a modern influencer collects followers, and each conquest was both a personal pleasure and a political calculation. Think about it, when the Empress of Rome invites you to her private chambers, are you going to say no? Of course not. But more importantly, once you've been there, you're compromised. You're part of her network now, whether you wanted to be or not. She had turned the imperial bedroom into a recruitment center for the world's most exclusive and most dangerous loyalty program. By 47 AD, Messalina's influence had grown to the point where she was effectively running a shadow government. Claudius, her husband, was brilliant, but politically naive, more interested in historical research and infrastructure projects than the daily business of empire management. This left Messalina free to operate what amounted to her own personal administration, complete with appointments, policy decisions, and even executions. But here's where her strategy started to backfire. Messalina's network was built on fear and desire, not loyalty or mutual benefit. Her lovers stayed loyal because they were terrified of the consequences of betrayal, not because they believed in her vision or trusted her judgment. This made her powerful, but it also made her vulnerable in ways she didn't fully understand. Enter Olivia, watching all of this unfold, with the calculating eye of someone who understood that every empire contains the seeds of its own destruction. While everyone else in Rome was either cowering from Messalina's power, or trying to curry favor with her, Livia was studying her weaknesses like a general preparing for siege warfare. And here's what Livia noticed that everyone else missed. Messalina's entire power structure was built on maintaining the illusion of invincibility. She rolled through the assumption that she was untouchable, unbeatable, and utterly without peer in the arts of manipulation and control. But illusions, no matter how carefully maintained, are fragile things. All it would take was one person willing to call her bluff. One person clever enough to expose the Empress's vulnerabilities without getting themselves executed in the process. One person with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from bringing down Rome's most powerful woman. Someone exactly like Livia. The confrontation that followed wasn't planned as a single dramatic showdown. It was more like a chess match played out over months, with each woman making increasingly bold moves, while the entire empire watched in fascination and horror. But it started with something surprisingly simple. Livia decided to throw a party. Not just any party. A party specifically designed to demonstrate that everything Messalina could do, Livia could do better, more cleverly, and with more style. A party that would serve as both celebration and declaration of war. The ancient sources describe it as the most scandalous social event in Roman history, which, considering this is the civilization that gave us Caligula, is really saying something. The invitation itself was a work of art and psychological warfare, delivered on papyrus so fine it was practically transparent, written in gold ink, sealed with wax that had been mixed with crushed pearls. The message was simple, elegant, and absolutely loaded with subtext. Livia requests the pleasure of your company for an evening of philosophical discourse and artistic appreciation. Attire as your truest self. That last line? Pure genius. In a society where clothing was a rigid marker of social status, where every thread communicated your place in the hierarchy, as your truest self was essentially an invitation to social anarchy, it was Livia's way of saying, come as who you really are, not who Rome tells you to be. The guest list read like a who's who of Roman society, but with some very interesting additions. Senators, yes, but also their wives. Wealthy merchants, but also the artists and philosophers they usually ignored. Military commanders alongside the foreign diplomats they were supposedly keeping in check. And then there were the surprises. Slaves who had earned reputations for exceptional intelligence, freedmen who had built business empires, even a few barbarian chieftains who were visiting Rome on diplomatic missions. What Livia had done was create a social experiment disguised as a party. She was testing whether Rome's elite could handle being in a room where traditional power structures were temporarily suspended. It was like hosting a dinner party where the CEO has to sit next to the intern, except with higher stakes and more wine. The venue was Livia's villa, transformed for the occasion into something that contemporary accounts describe as a palace worthy of the gods, but with the warmth of a private home. Every detail had been carefully calculated to impress, without intimidating, to display wealth without ostentation. The gardens were lit with thousands of oil lamps, arranged to mimic constellations. The dining couches were covered in silk that had been dyed to shift color in the lamplight. The air was perfumed with incense that had been imported from the edges of the known world. But here's the brilliant part. None of it was designed to make guests feel inferior. Unlike the imperial palace, where every detail screamed, "Remember your place," Livia's villa whispered, "Imagine what you could become." It was aspiration made tangible, possibility given physical form. The evening began with what the Romans called a symposium, essentially a combination dinner party, intellectual salon, and strategic networking event. But Livia had reimagined the format entirely. Instead of the traditional rigid hierarchy where the most important guests reclined on the most honored couches, while everyone else arranged themselves in order of decreasing status, she had created circular arrangements where conversation could flow freely among equals. The topics of discussion weren't the usual safe political platitudes or philosophical abstractions. Livia had prepared a series of questions designed to reveal character, test intelligence, and create genuine connection among people who usually interacted only through formal protocols. Questions like, if you could rewrite one law of Rome, what would it be and why? And what truth do you know that you've never been able to speak aloud? The result was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. Senators found themselves genuinely debating policy with people who actually had to live under the laws they wrote. Military commanders discovered that barbarian chieftains had sophisticated strategies they'd never considered. Wealthy merchants realized that the slaves serving them had insights into economic theory that could revolutionize trade. But the real genius of the evening revealed itself as the night progressed. As wine flowed and conversations deepened, Livia began to orchestrate what can only be described as a masterclass in soft diplomacy. She didn't just facilitate conversations, she guided them, shaped them, used them to weave connections between people who had never realized they had common interests. A senator who had been struggling with grain supply issues suddenly found himself talking to a merchant who specialized in Egyptian imports. A general facing logistical challenges in Germania connected with a freedman who had developed new techniques for rapid road construction. A philosopher grappling with questions of ethics discovered that a foreign diplomat had been wrestling with the same problems from an entirely different cultural perspective. By midnight, what had started as a party had transformed into something unprecedented. A working session where Rome's most challenging problems were being addressed by the most diverse group of problem solvers ever assembled in one room, and orchestrating it all, moving through the conversations like a conductor leading a symphony, was Livia herself. But here's where the evening took its most dangerous turn. As the formal discussions wound down, and the gathering shifted into more intimate conversations, Livia made her boldest move yet. She announced that there would be entertainment, but not the usual musicians or dancers. Instead, she had arranged for a series of performances that would demonstrate the true arts of Roman civilization. What followed was a showcase that managed to be simultaneously the most sophisticated cultural event Rome had ever seen, and the most scandalous challenge to imperial authority ever attempted. And that's when Messalina's spies, who had been monitoring the gathering all evening, realized they needed to send an urgent message to the Empress. Livia wasn't just throwing a party, she was staging a revolution. The entertainment that night wasn't just performance, it was propaganda disguised as art. Revolution wrapped in silk and set to music. Livia had commissioned a series of pieces that would demonstrate, without ever saying it directly, that everything Messalina represented could be done with more intelligence, more mise, and infinitely more sophistication. The first performance was a dance that told the story of Rome's founding, but not the sanitized version taught to schoolchildren. This was the real story, the violence, the betrayal, the desperate ambition that built an empire. The dancer, a woman whose identity remains lost to history, moved through sequences that somehow managed to be both breathtakingly beautiful and deeply unsettling. She portrayed Romulus and Remus, the rape of the Sabine women, the brutal pragmatism that turned a collection of hill tribes into masters of the Mediterranean. But here's what made it brilliant. The dance didn't condemn Rome's violent origins. Instead, it celebrated them while simultaneously asking the audience to consider what that violence had cost and what it might cost in the future. It was patriotic and subversive at the same time, a masterpiece of artistic diplomacy that left viewers simultaneously proud of their heritage and uncomfortably aware of its implications. The second piece was even more daring, a theatrical performance that retold the story of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. But from Cleopatra's perspective, in an empire where women were expected to be supporting characters in men's stories, here was a piece that portrayed a woman as the strategic mastermind of one of history's greatest political alliances. The actress in this detail survives in multiple sources, delivered her performance entirely in Greek, Latin, and Egyptian, switching between languages to demonstrate not just linguistic skill, but cultural fluency. She didn't just play Cleopatra, she embodied the intellectual sophistication that had made the Egyptian queen a worthy partner for Rome's greatest general. But the real genius was in the subtext. Without ever mentioning Messalina directly, the performance raised questions about what it meant for a powerful woman to use her sexuality strategically, what the difference was between political alliance and personal indulgence, and whether Rome's current empress was following Cleopatra's example or missing the point entirely. The third performance was where Livia truly showed her hand. A philosopher, one of the most respected intellectual figures in Rome, delivered what was technically a lecture on the nature of power and virtue, but was actually a systematic deconstruction of everything Messalina's rule represented, speaking in the careful, measured tones that Romans associated with wisdom and authority. He explored questions that cut straight to the heart of the empire's current problems. Can power exercised without restraint truly be called virtue? Does the ability to act without consequences demonstrate strength or reveal weakness? What is the difference between commanding respect and demanding submission? Every person in that room understood that they weren't just listening to abstract philosophy. They were hearing a direct critique of imperial policy, delivered by someone with impeccable credentials, and unquestionable loyalty to Rome itself. It was revolution disguised as education, delivered with such sophisticated rhetoric that anyone who tried to call it treason would sound like they were attacking scholarship itself. But Livia saved her masterstroke for last. The final performance was a musical composition that had been written specifically for the evening. A piece that told the story of Rome's greatest heroines throughout history. Not the usual suspects like Lucretia or Cornelia, but the forgotten women, the ones who had influenced policy from behind the scenes, who had saved the empire through intelligence rather than sacrifice, who had wielded power through wit rather than wealth or birth. The music itself was hauntingly beautiful, performed by a small ensemble of the finest musicians in Rome. But the real impact came from the lyrics, which managed to celebrate these forgotten heroines while implicitly asking why contemporary Rome seemed to have forgotten their example. Why had the empire that produced such intelligent, strategic, effective female leaders now settled for leaders whose primary qualification seemed to be their willingness to shock rather than their ability to actually lead? By the time the evening ended, shortly before dawn, every person in attendance understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented. This hadn't been just a party. It had been a demonstration of what Roman civilization could look like when guided by intelligence rather than impulse, by strategic thinking rather than raw power, by sophisticated culture rather than mere spectacle. More importantly, they had seen an alternative to Messalina's reign of chaotic indulgence. They had glimpsed what leadership might look like when wielded by someone who understood that true power comes not from the ability to do whatever you want, but from the wisdom to know what should be done. And here's what made it truly dangerous. Livia had made her point without saying anything directly treasonous, without making any explicit challenges to imperial authority, without doing anything that could be prosecuted under Roman law. She had staged a revolution using nothing but art, philosophy, and impeccable taste, which of course made it infinitely more threatening than any armed rebellion could have been. The reports that reached Messalina the next morning made it clear that something had shifted in Rome's power dynamics. The empress, who had built her authority on being shocking, unpredictable, and utterly without peer in the arts of scandalous behavior, had just been upstaged by someone who made scandal look sophisticated and made power look elegant. The war between them was about to begin in earnest. News of Livia's gathering spread through Rome faster than gossip at a modern awards show after party. By the time Messalina received the detailed reports from her network of spies and informants, the entire social landscape of the empire had already begun to shift in ways that would have been unimaginable just days before. Here's what made the situation so dangerous for Messalina. She had built her power on being the most shocking, the most unpredictable, the most absolutely without limits person in Rome. Her authority came from the assumption that nobody would dare challenge her, because nobody could match her willingness to break every social convention, violate every expectation, and shatter every boundary. But Livia hadn't challenged Messalina by trying to outshock her. Instead, she had done something far more subversive. She had made shocking behavior look crude and unsophisticated by comparison. It was like watching someone respond to a screaming argument by speaking more quietly. Suddenly the person yelling looks unhinged while the person speaking softly looks dignified and in control. The morning after the party, something unprecedented began happening in Rome's social circles. People who had spent years walking on eggshells around Messalina's unpredictable moods and violent temper suddenly found themselves asking questions they'd never dared voice before. What if there was another way to wield power? What if strength didn't have to look like chaos? What if intelligence was more impressive than shock value? These weren't revolutionary thoughts in the sense of plotting against the empire. They were revolutionary in the sense of imagining that the empire could be something more sophisticated than it currently was. And that made them infinitely more dangerous to Messalina's authority than any military conspiracy could have been. Because here's the thing about power built on fear and unpredictability. It only works as long as everyone believes there are no alternatives. The moment people start imagining different possibilities, the whole structure becomes vulnerable. It's like realizing that the scary boss everyone's afraid of is actually just a bully with good PR. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Messalina's response was swift, and in retrospect, exactly the wrong move for someone trying to maintain an image of sophisticated authority. Rather than rising above the challenge or demonstrating her own intellectual sophistication, she fell back on her default strategy: intimidation through chaos. Within days of Livia's gathering, several of the attendees found themselves facing sudden tax audits that revealed mysterious discrepancies requiring immediate payment. Others discovered that permits for their businesses had been mysteriously revoked, pending administrative review. A few of the foreign diplomats were informed that their credentials were being re-evaluated, and they might need to leave Rome pending further investigation. It was textbook authoritarian harassment. Use bureaucratic machinery to make life difficult for people you can't directly attack. But here's what Messalina failed to understand. In using these tactics, she was proving Livia's point more effectively than any philosophical argument could have. Every person who received these harassing visits, every family that faced sudden bureaucratic obstacles, became a walking advertisement for the idea that Rome's current leadership was petty, vindictive, and fundamentally unworthy of the empire they claimed to represent. Messalina was essentially providing free marketing for the very alternative she was trying to suppress. But Livia's response to this harassment campaign was what truly demonstrated the difference between their approaches to power. Where most people would have either backed down in fear or escalated to direct confrontation, Livia did something completely unexpected. She offered to not help in the sense of using her own network to retaliate against Messalina. That would have been playing the same game by the same rules. Instead, she offered practical, intelligent assistance to everyone who was facing imperial harassment. When merchants found their permits revoked, Livia connected them with legal experts who knew how to navigate the bureaucracy. When diplomats faced credential challenges, she introduced them to other officials who could provide alternative paths forward. She wasn't fighting the system, she was demonstrating that the system could work better when guided by intelligence and good faith, rather than spite and paranoia. It was like watching someone respond to a cyber attack by improving their security rather than launching a counterattack. More effective, more sustainable, and infinitely more impressive to anyone paying attention. The result was that within weeks, Livia had transformed from an individual challenger to Messalina's authority into the center of an informal network of people who had experienced firsthand the difference between leadership based on fear and leadership based on competence. This wasn't a conspiracy. There were no secret meetings, no coded messages, no plots against the imperial family. It was something much more dangerous. It was the organic emergence of an alternative power structure based on entirely different principles. Instead of loyalty through fear, loyalty through mutual benefit. Instead of obedience through intimidation, cooperation through shared interest. Think of it like this. Messalina had built a social media empire based on controversy and drama, where followers stayed engaged because they were afraid of missing the next explosive meltdown. Livia was building a different kind of platform entirely, one where people participated because they actually got value from the experience, where influence came from providing useful insights rather than generating outrage. And here's the crucial difference. Messalina's model required her to constantly escalate, to keep finding new ways to shock and intimidate, because attention based on controversy has diminishing returns. Livia's model was sustainable. It got stronger over time as people experienced the benefits of intelligent cooperation over chaotic competition. By late 48 AD, less than 6 months after that first fateful gathering, Rome had effectively developed two parallel power structures operating by completely different rules, and everyone knew that eventually they would have to confront each other directly. The question was, who would make the first move? What happened next reads like something from a modern psychological thriller, except with togas and significantly higher stakes. Messalina, faced with the growing influence of someone who made her look primitive by comparison, decided to do what she did best, organize a spectacle so outrageous that it would remind everyone why they should be afraid of her. The event she planned was, technically speaking, a wedding. But calling it a wedding is like calling the Titanic a boat trip. Technically accurate, but missing the point entirely. What Messalina organized was a public demonstration of her absolute power to violate every social norm, religious tradition and legal precedent that supposedly governed Roman society. Here's the setup. Messalina was already married to Emperor Claudius, but in late 48 AD, she decided to publicly marry Gaius Silius, one of Rome's most distinguished senators and widely considered one of the most handsome men in the empire. Not divorce Claudius first, and then remarry. That would have been scandalous but legally possible. No, she decided to simply add a second husband while keeping the first one. From a modern perspective, this might seem like a progressive statement about marriage equality or polyamory. But in Roman society where marriage was fundamentally a legal and political institution, what Messalina was doing was essentially declaring that laws applied to everyone except her. It was like a modern CEO announcing they were going to ignore securities regulations, because rules are for little people. But here's where it gets really interesting. Messalina didn't just want to break the rules privately, she wanted to make sure everyone knew she was breaking them. The wedding ceremony was planned as a public event, complete with all the traditional religious rituals, legal proceedings, and social celebrations that normally accompanied aristocratic marriages. She was essentially forcing Rome to watch her commit what was, legally speaking, bigamy, adultery, and treason, all at the same time. It was performance art as political intimidation, a way of saying, I can do absolutely anything I want, and you will all not only tolerate it, but celebrate it. And here's the truly brilliant part of her plan. By making the ceremony public and official, she was forcing everyone in Rome to choose sides. Either you attended the wedding and implicitly endorsed her right to ignore all laws and traditions, or you stayed away and marked yourself as her enemy. There was no neutral ground. It should have been the ultimate power move, a demonstration so shocking that it would remind everyone that Messalina existed in a realm beyond normal human limitations. Instead, it became the mistake that handed Livia the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the difference between power and wisdom. Because while Messalina was planning her scandalous second wedding, Livia was quietly doing something much more subversive. She was having conversations, not dramatic confrontations or public challenges, just private, thoughtful discussions with the people who mattered most. The senators who would be expected to attend Messalina's wedding, the priests who would be asked to perform ceremonies that violated religious law, the citizens who would be forced to pretend that bigamy was somehow normal and acceptable. Livia didn't tell anyone what to do. She didn't organize boycotts or plan counter-demonstrations. Instead, she simply asked people questions. What do you think this means for Roman law? How do you think this affects the stability of marriage as a social institution? What precedent does this set for future generations? She was essentially providing people with a framework for thinking critically about what they were being asked to endorse. It was like being the friend who doesn't tell you your relationship is toxic, but asks just enough pointed questions that you start figuring it out for yourself. The result was that by the time Messalina's wedding day arrived, much of Rome's elite had already reached their own conclusions about what they were witnessing. This wasn't a demonstration of imperial power. It was a demonstration of imperial indulgence run completely out of control. The wedding itself was everything Messalina had planned: elaborate, shocking, impossible to ignore. The ceremony was performed with full religious honors. The legal contracts were signed with all proper formalities. The celebration afterward was legendary in its extravagance. But something was missing that Messalina hadn't anticipated. The sense of awe and intimidation that usually accompanied her public violations of social norms. Instead of gasping in shock at her audacity, people were watching with what can only be described as anthropological curiosity. They weren't seeing a goddess among mortals. They were seeing a case study in what happens when power operates without wisdom. And then Livia made her masterstroke. On the evening of Messalina's wedding, while the Empress was celebrating her bigamous marriage with a feast that reportedly cost more than most cities' annual budgets, Livia hosted a small, intimate dinner party at her villa. The guest list was tiny, maybe 20 people at most, but every single person invited was someone whose opinion carried weight in Roman society. Not the richest or most powerful, but the most respected. The people whose judgment others trusted, whose approval actually meant something. The evening wasn't organized around Messalina's wedding at all. Officially, it was a discussion of Marcus Aurelius's recent philosophical writings, but the conversation naturally turned to questions of leadership, wisdom, and the responsibility that comes with power. And somehow, without anyone mentioning the Empress directly, the discussion became an implicit comparison between two completely different approaches to authority. On one side, power wielded for personal gratification, without regard for consequences or precedent. Leadership as performance, authority as spectacle, influence through shock value and intimidation. On the other side, power exercised with restraint and purpose, guided by long-term thinking and genuine concern for the welfare of the community. Leadership through example, authority through competence, influence through demonstrated wisdom. By the end of the evening, everyone present understood that they had been given a choice. Not between supporting or opposing Messalina, but between two fundamentally different visions of what Roman civilization could become. And here's the thing that made Livia's approach so devastatingly effective. She never asked anyone to choose her side over Messalina's. She simply provided a living demonstration of the alternative, and let people draw their own conclusions, which they did, rapidly and decisively. The morning after Messalina's wedding brought news that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Emperor Claudius, who had been away from Rome on imperial business, had returned to find his wife publicly married to another man, and was understandably not taking it well. Now Claudius wasn't exactly known for swift, decisive action. This was a man who had survived decades of imperial politics by being underestimated, by letting others assume he was too distracted by his scholarly interests to pay attention to political maneuvering. But there's a difference between being politically cautious and being personally humiliated on a scale that made Rome's enemies laugh, and its allies question the stability of imperial authority. The official records of what happened next are, shall we say, diplomatically edited, but reading between the lines of surviving accounts, it's clear that Claudius faced a choice that went far beyond personal betrayal. He could either reassert imperial authority, or watch the entire concept of Roman law become meaningless. Because here's what Messalina had failed to understand about power. It only works when other people believe in it. The moment a leader demonstrates that they consider themselves above the systems that govern everyone else, they invite everyone else to question why those systems should be respected at all. Messalina had essentially announced that marriage contracts were meaningless if you had enough power to ignore them. But if marriage contracts could be ignored by the powerful, what about trade agreements, military treaties, tax obligations, property rights? The entire legal framework that held the empire together was based on the assumption that laws applied to everyone, even emperors. By making her bigamy so public and celebratory, Messalina had accidentally created a constitutional crisis that threatened the foundational principles of Roman governance, and Claudius, for all his scholarly distractedness, was smart enough to understand that allowing it to stand would essentially invite civil war. The emperor's response was swift, brutal, and absolutely final. Messalina and her new husband Gaius Silius were executed for treason, along with most of their inner circle. But here's the detail that really matters for our story. In the chaos that followed, several other prominent figures were arrested, investigated, and found guilty of various crimes against the state, except for one person who should have been at the top of everyone's suspect list: Livia. Despite having hosted gatherings that were clearly critical of imperial policy, despite having built an alternative power network that challenged Messalina's authority, despite being the obvious rival around whom opposition had coalesced, Livia somehow emerged from the purge completely unscathed. How? Because she had been so careful to operate within Roman law, so meticulous about never crossing the line from criticism to treason, so sophisticated in her methods that there was literally nothing she could be prosecuted for. She had staged a revolution using dinner parties, philosophy discussions, and artistic performances. She had challenged imperial authority using scholarship, hospitality, and intellectual discourse. Try explaining to a Roman court why someone should be executed for hosting sophisticated conversations or commissioning thoughtful entertainment. Try prosecuting someone for the crime of making other people look unsophisticated by comparison. But here's where the story takes its most fascinating turn. Rather than disappearing into obscurity after Messalina's fall, Livia found herself in a position she had probably never imagined. With the empress dead and the imperial court in chaos, Rome desperately needed someone who could provide stability, wisdom, and legitimate authority. Not official authority. Claudius would soon remarry, and his new wife Agrippina would bring her own form of ruthless political intelligence to the imperial household. But unofficial authority, the kind of influence that comes from being the person everyone trusts to give good advice, to host important conversations, to facilitate the kind of sophisticated discourse that keeps an empire running smoothly. In the aftermath of Messalina's spectacular self-destruction, Livia had become something unprecedented in Roman history, a woman with significant political influence, who had gained it not through family connections, marriage alliances, or sexual manipulation, but through demonstrated competence and intellectual authority. She was, in effect, Rome's first female public intellectual. And the network she had built, the connections between senators and merchants, philosophers and generals, Romans and foreigners, didn't disappear with Messalina's death. If anything, it became more valuable as Rome struggled to rebuild its damaged institutions. Think about it. In a city where trust in traditional authority had been shattered by imperial chaos, who were people going to turn to for guidance? The politicians who had enabled Messalina's excesses, the courtiers who had participated in her corruption, or the woman who had consistently demonstrated better judgment, higher standards, and more sophisticated thinking? The choice was obvious, and for the first time in Roman history, a woman who had started life as a slave had become one of the most influential people in the empire, not through conquest or inheritance or marriage, but through intelligence, strategy, and the patient construction of a network based on mutual respect rather than fear. But here's the thing about reaching the top of any power structure. That's when you discover who your real enemies are. And Livia was about to learn that while she had defeated Messalina, she had also attracted the attention of someone far more dangerous. Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's new wife and the mother of a young man named Nero. The game was about to change entirely. If Messalina had been a hurricane, destructive, chaotic, impossible to predict, but ultimately self-limiting, then Agrippina the Younger was something far more dangerous. She was a laser, focused, precise, absolutely ruthless in pursuit of clearly defined objectives, where Messalina had wielded power like a drunk person swinging a sword. Lots of damage, but mostly to herself. Agrippina approached politics like a chess grandmaster who could see 20 moves ahead and had already decided exactly how the game would end. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Agrippina had grown up watching the imperial family destroy itself through a combination of paranoia, excess, and strategic incompetence. She had seen her brothers exiled and murdered, watched her first husband die under suspicious circumstances, survived the reign of her psychotic brother Caligula, and emerged from it all with two crucial insights. First, that power without purpose was meaningless, and second, that in the imperial family, you either controlled the game, or you became a casualty of it. When she married Claudius in 49 AD, barely a year after Messalina's execution, Agrippina brought something to the imperial household that had been missing for decades: long-term strategic thinking. She didn't want to be empress for the sake of shocking people or indulging her appetites. She wanted to be empress, because she had plans for the empire, and more importantly, she had plans to ensure that her son Nero would eventually inherit it. This made her infinitely more dangerous to Livia's growing influence than Messalina had ever been. Where Messalina had seen Livia as a rival to be crushed, Agrippina saw her as a problem to be solved, and Agrippina was very, very good at solving problems. The first sign of trouble came subtly, as these things always do. Livia began noticing that her invitations to certain social events were mysteriously delayed or lost entirely. Nothing dramatic, just enough bureaucratic friction to make it clear that someone with significant influence was working to isolate her from key conversations. Then came the whisper campaign. Carefully orchestrated rumors about Livia's past, her loyalties, her true motivations for building such an extensive network of contacts. Nothing that could be traced back to Agrippina directly, but all carrying the same implicit message: this woman is more dangerous than she appears, and anyone who trusts her is making a mistake. But here's where Agrippina made her first serious miscalculation. She assumed that Livia's influence was built on the same foundation as most Roman power networks: fear, obligation, and mutual blackmail. She thought that if she could discredit Livia personally, the entire network would collapse, as people rushed to distance themselves from someone who had fallen from imperial favor. Instead, something unexpected happened. The people in Livia's network didn't abandon her when rumors started circulating. They defended her, not out of fear or obligation, but because they had experienced firsthand the value of what she had created. They had seen how much more effectively problems could be solved when intelligent people worked together instead of against each other. This was completely unprecedented in Roman politics. Personal loyalty based on respect and mutual benefit rather than fear and self-interest. Networks that got stronger under pressure instead of fragmenting. It was like discovering a new form of physics that made all previous assumptions about political gravity obsolete. Agrippina, being both intelligent and pragmatic, quickly recognized that she was dealing with something she didn't fully understand. So she decided to study her opponent more carefully, using the same methodical approach that had served her so well in other political challenges. What she discovered was both fascinating and alarming. Livia had essentially created a shadow government that operated by completely different rules than official Roman institutions, where the imperial bureaucracy was hierarchical, slow-moving, and focused on maintaining existing power structures. Livia's network was collaborative, adaptive, and focused on solving actual problems. More importantly, it was effective. The economic policies that emerged from Livia's dinner conversations were producing better results than official imperial initiatives. The diplomatic strategies developed in her salon were preventing conflicts that traditional Roman diplomacy might have escalated into wars. Even the cultural and artistic innovations she sponsored were enhancing Rome's reputation throughout the empire. Agrippina faced a choice that would define her entire reign as empress. She could try to destroy this alternative power structure and risk losing access to its obviously superior problem-solving capabilities, or she could try to co-opt it and risk legitimizing a rival who might eventually challenge imperial authority directly. Being Agrippina, she chose a third option. She decided to create her own version. If Livia could build influence through intellectual sophistication and strategic networking, then Agrippina would demonstrate that she could do the same thing, but with the added advantage of official imperial backing. It would be a competition between two completely different approaches to power, played out on the grandest stage in the ancient world. The battle that followed wasn't fought with armies or assassinations. It was fought with ideas, innovations, and competing visions of what Roman civilization could become. And it would determine not just who controlled the empire, but what kind of empire it would be for generations to come. The stakes could not have been higher. The future of the known world would be decided by two brilliant women who had started from opposite ends of Roman society, but had both reached the same conclusion that intelligence, properly applied, was the most powerful force in human affairs. Let the games begin. What followed was perhaps the most sophisticated power struggle in ancient history. A competition fought not with weapons or armies, but with competing demonstrations of intellectual superiority and administrative effectiveness. It was like watching two master chess players, except the board was the entire Roman Empire, and every move affected millions of lives. Agrippina's opening gambit was brilliant in its simplicity. She established what she called imperial advisory councils, formal committees composed of the empire's most distinguished experts in various fields, tasked with providing systematic analysis of policy challenges and recommendations for improvement. On paper, it looked like exactly the kind of rational, evidence-based governance that Livia had been advocating, but the genius was in the details. These weren't informal networking sessions or voluntary intellectual salons, they were official imperial institutions, with formal authority, regular budgets, and direct access to the emperor himself. Agrippina was essentially offering everyone in Livia's network something Livia could never provide: the opportunity to see their ideas actually implemented on an empire-wide scale. Why settle for being an influential dinner party guest when you could be an official imperial advisor? It should have been checkmate. Agrippina had superior resources, official authority, and the backing of imperial law. She was offering everyone who mattered the chance to trade up from unofficial influence to official power. Any rational person would have abandoned Livia's amateur salon for Agrippina's professional policy institute. Except that Livia understood something about human motivation that Agrippina had missed. Yes, people wanted their ideas to matter, but they also wanted to be treated as intelligent equals rather than useful subordinates. They wanted to participate in conversations, not just provide expert testimony. They wanted to be part of a community, not just employees of an institution. Livia's response to Agrippina's challenge was characteristically subtle and devastatingly effective. She transformed her informal network into something that looks suspiciously like the modern world's first think tank. But instead of competing directly with Agrippina's imperial councils, she focused on doing what they couldn't do: fostering genuine intellectual collaboration between people from completely different backgrounds, encouraging innovative thinking that transcended traditional disciplinary boundaries, and creating space for the kind of creative problem-solving that only happens when brilliant minds are free to explore ideas without worrying about official consequences. Where Agrippina's councils were producing policy recommendations, Livia's network was generating breakthrough insights. Where the imperial committees were improving existing systems, Livia's collaborators were imagining entirely new approaches to governance, economics, and social organization. The difference became clear within months. Agrippina's councils were undeniably effective. They produced more coherent, better researched policy proposals than the imperial bureaucracy had ever managed. But they were still operating within existing frameworks, still constrained by what was politically feasible and administratively practical. Livia's network, freed from those constraints, was producing ideas so innovative that they wouldn't be rediscovered by European civilization for another 1,000 years. Concepts that resembled modern economic theory, political structures that anticipated constitutional government, social innovations that prefigured everything from public education to representative democracy. But here's what made the competition truly fascinating: both women were succeeding. Agrippina's systematic approach to imperial administration was making the empire run more smoothly and effectively than it had in generations. Livia's experimental approach to intellectual collaboration was generating insights that could revolutionize human civilization. The problem was that their successes were starting to highlight a fundamental tension in Roman society itself. Was the empire's purpose to maintain existing power structures as efficiently as possible, or to serve as a laboratory for discovering better ways of organizing human society? This wasn't just an abstract philosophical question. It had immediate practical implications. Should Rome focus on perfecting its current systems, or experimenting with new ones? Should imperial policy prioritize stability or innovation? Should the empire's intellectual resources be directed towards serving existing institutions or challenging them to evolve? By 54 AD, this tension had reached a critical point. Claudius, caught between his systematically competent wife and the most intellectually vibrant network in Roman society, was struggling to balance competing demands that were becoming increasingly incompatible. And then, in what can only be described as one of history's most convenient coincidences, Claudius died suddenly of what official records describe as natural causes, and what everyone who knew Agrippina suspected was something considerably more strategic. With Nero's ascension to the throne at age 16, guided by his mother's advice, and supported by her institutional innovations, it looked like Agrippina had finally won the competition decisively. She had official power, imperial authority, and a malleable emperor who owed his position entirely to her political maneuvering. But Livia had something that proved to be more durable than official authority. She had created a network of relationships and ideas that could survive political transitions, and she had done something even more important. She had demonstrated that there were alternatives to the traditional Roman approach to power, governance, and social organization. The question now was whether those alternatives would be allowed to flourish in Nero's Rome, or whether Agrippina would use her newfound imperial authority to eliminate the last challenge to traditional power structures. The answer would determine not just Livia's fate, but the future direction of Western civilization itself. Young Emperor Nero presented both women with a challenge. Neither had fully anticipated. What do you do when the person you're trying to influence turns out to be more cunning than either of his would-be puppeteers? At 16, Nero was supposed to be a malleable teenager, grateful for adult guidance and easily controlled by whoever provided the best combination of flattery and direction. Agrippina had spent years preparing for this moment, building the institutional framework that would allow her to rule through her son while maintaining the appearance of proper imperial authority. Livia, meanwhile, had assumed that Nero's ascension would mark the end of her influence, that Agrippina would use imperial power to marginalize or eliminate anyone who represented an alternative approach to Roman governance. Both women had seriously underestimated their new emperor. Nero had grown up watching the palace intrigue that surrounded Claudius's reign. He had seen how Messalina's chaos had nearly destroyed imperial authority, observed how Agrippina's systematic approach had restored stability, and noticed how Livia's intellectual network had generated the most innovative ideas anyone had seen in generations. More importantly, he had reached a conclusion that neither woman anticipated. Why choose between systematic efficiency and innovative thinking when you could have both? Nero's early reign was marked by what historians would later call philosophical pragmatism, a governing approach that combined Agrippina's institutional competence with Livia's intellectual creativity. He kept his mother's advisory councils and administrative reforms while simultaneously expanding support for the kind of experimental thinking that Livia's network had pioneered. It was like having a government that functioned with German efficiency while innovating with Silicon Valley creativity. And for a brief shining moment, it looked like Rome might actually achieve something unprecedented, a political system that was both stable and adaptable, both effective and innovative. But here's where things got complicated. Nero wasn't content to just synthesize his mother's and Livia's approaches to governance. He wanted to surpass them both. And he had some ideas about how to do that which were, let's say, ambitious beyond anything either woman had imagined. Nero had noticed that both Agrippina and Livia, for all their sophistication, were still fundamentally limited by Roman assumptions about power, authority, and social organization. They were trying to make the existing system work better, but they weren't questioning whether the system itself was the right approach. What if, Nero wondered, you could combine political authority with artistic vision? What if you could use imperial power, not just to govern an empire, but to transform human civilization itself? What if you could make Rome not just the most powerful political entity in history, but the most beautiful, most creative, most intellectually sophisticated society the world had ever seen? This was the kind of thinking that made both Agrippina and Livia nervous, but for different reasons. Agrippina worried that Nero was becoming distracted from the practical business of governance by artistic fantasies. Livia worried that he was conflating political power with creative authority in ways that could lead to exactly the kind of imperial excess that had destroyed Messalina. Their concerns proved to be well-founded. Nero's vision of Rome as the ultimate fusion of political power and artistic achievement began to manifest in increasingly grandiose projects. The Domus Aurea, his golden house, was designed to be not just an imperial residence, but a living artwork that would demonstrate Rome's cultural sophistication to the entire world. His public performances as a musician and actor were meant to show that even emperors could embrace artistic excellence. But most ambitiously, he began planning what he called cultural diplomacy initiatives, systematic efforts to use Roman artistic and intellectual achievements to win the loyalty of conquered peoples, not through force, but through genuine admiration for Roman civilization. It was a brilliant concept in theory. Instead of ruling through military occupation and economic exploitation, Rome would maintain its empire by being genuinely superior in ways that made other cultures want to emulate rather than resist Roman influence. The problem was that implementing this vision required resources on a scale that even the Roman Empire struggled to sustain. The cultural projects, the artistic patronage, the massive infrastructure improvements needed to support Nero's vision of aesthetic imperialism, all of it cost money that had to come from somewhere. And that's when the three-way collaboration between Nero, Agrippina, and Livia began to fracture. Agrippina's systematic approach to governance, emphasized fiscal responsibility and administrative efficiency. Livia's intellectual network valued innovation and experimentation, but within reasonable limits. Nero's artistic vision required both women to support projects that challenged their fundamental assumptions about what government should prioritize. The conflict that emerged wasn't personal, it was philosophical. Three brilliant people with genuinely compatible goals had discovered that their methods were ultimately incompatible. Agrippina believed in perfecting existing systems. Livia believed in gradual innovation within sustainable limits. Nero believed in revolutionary transformation regardless of cost. The tension reached its breaking point in 59 AD, when Nero made a decision that shocked both women and ultimately changed the course of Roman history. He decided that his mother's systematic approach to governance was constraining his vision, and that Livia's intellectual caution was limiting his ambitions. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most pivotal moments in the history of Western civilization. The moment when Rome chose artistic greatness over political stability, creative vision over administrative competence, and imperial grandeur over intellectual wisdom. It was also the moment when Livia realized that the revolution she had started might have succeeded too well, and that the alternatives to traditional power she had pioneered might be just as dangerous as the systems she had sought to replace. The morning Agrippina died, officially in a boating accident, though everyone knew better, Livia faced a realization that revolutionaries throughout history have had to confront. Sometimes the forces you unleash end up consuming everything you hope to protect. She had spent years demonstrating that there were alternatives to traditional Roman approaches to power. She had proven that intelligence could triumph over brutality, that networks based on mutual respect were more durable than hierarchies based on fear, that innovative thinking could solve problems that conventional wisdom couldn't address. But in doing so, she had also opened a door to possibilities that were more dangerous than anything she had intended. Nero's decision to eliminate his mother wasn't just matricide, it was the logical conclusion of the idea that existing institutions and traditional authorities could be discarded whenever they became inconvenient. If empresses could be challenged by courtesans, if imperial councils could be replaced by intellectual salons, if established systems could be continuously reinvented based on new ideas, then what was to stop an emperor from deciding that even the most basic constraints on imperial power were simply outdated traditions that could be eliminated? Livia had wanted to make Roman governance more intelligent and effective. Instead, she had helped create conditions that enabled the most destructive imperial reign in Roman history. The irony was devastating. The woman who had built her reputation on superior judgment had inadvertently contributed to empowering someone whose judgment would nearly destroy the civilization she had spent her life trying to improve. But here's what made Livia truly exceptional. Instead of retreating into denial or self-pity when she recognized her mistake, she immediately began working to correct it. If her innovations had helped create this problem, then her intelligence could be used to solve it. The challenge was that Nero, now freed from both his mother's systematic constraints and any obligation to respect Livia's intellectual authority, had become essentially uncontrollable. He had imperial power, popular support. His artistic projects and public performances were genuinely popular with ordinary Romans, and enough political sophistication to neutralize traditional forms of opposition. Conventional Roman approaches to limiting imperial excess, senatorial pressure, military threats, popular unrest were all ineffective against an emperor who understood how to use cultural projects and public entertainment to maintain loyalty while ignoring political criticism. But Livia had something that traditional Roman opposition lacked. She understood how systems of influence actually worked, and she had spent years building networks that operated by different rules than official political institutions. Her response to Nero's increasingly destructive reign was characteristically subtle and strategically brilliant. Instead of opposing him directly, she began working to preserve and protect the intellectual and cultural innovations that his excesses threatened to destroy. Think of it as intellectual disaster preparedness. If Nero's artistic imperialism was going to bankrupt the empire, then someone needed to ensure that the genuine advances in knowledge, governance, and social organization that had emerged during this period would survive the inevitable collapse. Livia began what can only be described as a systematic effort to document, preserve, and transmit the ideas that had emerged from her network during its most productive years. Not just the formal policy recommendations or philosophical treatises, but the practical insights about human cooperation, organizational effectiveness, and innovative problem-solving that had made her salon more effective than official imperial institutions. She commissioned detailed records of successful experiments in local governance. She funded the preservation of artistic and literary works that demonstrated new approaches to creative expression. Most importantly, she began training a new generation of intellectual leaders who could carry these innovations into whatever political system emerged after Nero's inevitable downfall. It was like creating a cultural time capsule designed to preserve the best ideas of Roman civilization through what she correctly anticipated would be a period of destructive chaos. But Livia's most important innovation during this period was something that wouldn't be fully understood until much later. She began developing what we might now recognize as early theories of institutional design and systemic resilience. Having watched how different approaches to power, Messalina's chaos, Agrippina's systematization, Nero's artistic authoritarianism, and her own intellectual networking, had succeeded and failed, she was developing insights about how human organizations actually function, what makes them sustainable, and how they can be designed to promote beneficial outcomes while limiting destructive possibilities. These weren't just abstract theories, they were practical guidelines for creating institutions that could harness human intelligence and creativity while preventing the concentration of power that made tyrants like Nero possible. The problem was that implementing these ideas required political stability and social cooperation that Nero's reign was systematically destroying. Rome was becoming increasingly chaotic as the emperor's artistic projects drained the treasury. His elimination of traditional constraints encouraged other forms of excess, and his focus on cultural transformation neglected the practical business of imperial administration. By 64 AD, when the Great Fire devastated Rome, it was clear that Nero's experiment in aesthetic imperialism was failing catastrophically. But it was also clear that traditional Roman approaches to governance, the systems that had enabled Messalina's chaos and necessitated Agrippina's systematic reforms, were inadequate for addressing the challenges facing an increasingly complex empire. What Rome needed was exactly what Livia had been developing: new approaches to organization and governance that could combine stability with adaptability, effectiveness with accountability, innovation with sustainability. The question was whether her ideas would survive long enough to influence whatever came after Nero's inevitable fall, and whether she herself would live to see them implemented. By 65 AD, as Nero's reign descended into the kind of chaos that makes historians use words like unprecedented and catastrophic, Livia found herself in a position that would be familiar to any modern expert who has watched their warnings prove accurate in the worst possible way. She had been right about everything. Her concerns about the dangers of unlimited imperial power had been vindicated. Her predictions about the unsustainability of governance based purely on artistic vision had come true. Her warnings about the need for institutional safeguards against authoritarian excess had been proven correct by events that were destroying the civilization she had spent her life trying to improve. Being right had never felt so much like losing. The Rome of 65 AD barely resembled the sophisticated, intellectually vibrant empire that had existed just a decade earlier. Nero's artistic projects had bankrupted the treasury. His elimination of traditional constraints on imperial behavior had encouraged corruption and excess throughout the administration. His focus on cultural transformation had left practical governance in the hands of incompetents and opportunists. Worse, the intellectual networks and innovative institutions that had represented the best of Roman civilization were being systematically destroyed, not by deliberate persecution, but by simple neglect and the chaos that accompanies societal breakdown. The scholars and administrators who had made Livia's salon a center of genuine innovation were fleeing Rome or withdrawing from public life. The experimental approaches to governance and social organization that had emerged from years of collaborative thinking were being abandoned as communities focused on simple survival. Even the artistic and cultural achievements that Nero claimed to value were suffering as resources disappeared and institutional support collapsed. Livia watched this destruction with the particular anguish of someone who understands exactly what is being lost and why it cannot be easily recovered. The knowledge, relationships, and institutional innovations that had taken decades to develop were being destroyed in months by forces that seemed as unstoppable as they were predictable. But here's what separated Livia from the countless other intelligent observers who have watched civilizations destroy themselves. She refused to accept that the situation was hopeless simply because it was catastrophic. If the existing political system was too corrupt and chaotic to preserve the intellectual and social innovations she had helped develop, then those innovations would have to be preserved through other means. If official Roman institutions were failing, then alternative institutions would have to be created. If the empire's cities were becoming unsafe for intellectual activity, then intellectual activity would have to move to places where it could continue safely. What Livia organized during the final years of Nero's reign was essentially the ancient world's first systematic effort at cultural preservation and intellectual continuity planning. Working through her network of former associates, she began establishing what can only be described as intellectual colonies throughout the empire. Communities where the approaches to learning, governance, and social organization she had pioneered could continue developing even if Rome itself collapsed completely. These weren't just schools or libraries. They were complete social experiments, designed to demonstrate that the innovations in human cooperation and institutional design that had emerged from her salon could function independently of imperial support or even imperial permission. Some were established in Greek cities that had maintained traditions of intellectual independence. Others were founded in prosperous provincial towns that were far enough from Rome to avoid direct imperial interference. A few were even created in barbarian territories beyond the empire's borders, where Roman refugees could experiment with new forms of social organization without worrying about imperial law. Each community was given the same basic mission: preserve and develop the knowledge, relationships, and institutional innovations that represented the best achievements of Roman civilization, while experimenting with new approaches that might prove more sustainable than traditional imperial governance. It was like creating a distributed backup system for human civilization itself. Multiple independent experiments in advanced social organization, all connected by shared principles and mutual communication, but none dependent on any central authority for their survival. The genius of this approach became clear when Nero's reign finally ended in 68 AD with his suicide and the civil wars that followed. While the official Roman government was paralyzed by succession crises and military conflicts, Livia's intellectual colonies continued functioning, developing, and demonstrating that sophisticated civilization could exist independently of imperial authority. More importantly, they served as refuges and resources for Romans who were fleeing the chaos of civil war. Instead of simply becoming refugees dependent on foreign charity, these displaced Romans found communities where their skills and knowledge were valued, where they could contribute to ongoing experiments in governance and social organization, and where the best traditions of Roman civilization were being preserved and enhanced rather than merely maintained. By 69 AD, when the year of the four emperors was tearing the empire apart, Livia's network of intellectual colonies had become perhaps the most stable and prosperous communities in the entire Mediterranean world. They were living proof that the innovations in human cooperation she had pioneered were not just interesting experiments, but practical alternatives to traditional approaches to social organization. But they were also something more dangerous. They were evidence that Roman civilization at its best could exist without Roman political authority. And that was a lesson that the empire's eventual survivors would have to decide whether to embrace or eliminate. The Flavian dynasty that emerged from the chaos of 68-69 AD faced a choice that would define the future of Western civilization. Should they try to restore traditional Roman governance, or should they embrace the innovations that had proven more resilient than imperial authority itself? Vespasian, the practical military commander who eventually won the civil wars and established the new dynasty, was initially inclined toward traditional restoration. After the chaos of Nero's artistic authoritarianism, there was obvious appeal in returning to the proven methods that had built the empire in the first place: clear hierarchies, practical governance, military strength, and fiscal responsibility. But Vespasian was also pragmatic enough to recognize that some of the innovations he encountered in Livia's intellectual colonies were simply too valuable to abandon. The approaches to administration, economic organization, and social cooperation that had emerged from her network were producing better results than traditional Roman methods in virtually every measurable way. The communities she had established weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Their governance was more effective, their economies more productive, their populations more educated, and more committed to their community's welfare than comparable traditional Roman settlements. More importantly, they were producing innovations at a rate that suggested they might be on the verge of breakthrough developments in everything from engineering to medicine to agricultural productivity. These weren't just successful experiments in alternative social organization, they were laboratories for advancing human knowledge and capability. Vespasian faced a dilemma that modern leaders would recognize. Should he suppress innovations that challenged traditional authority, but clearly represented improvements over existing systems? Or should he risk the stability of imperial governance by embracing approaches that might eventually make imperial authority itself obsolete? His solution was characteristically Roman in its practical sophistication. He decided to co-opt the innovations while containing their most dangerous implications. The Flavian administrative reforms incorporated many of the governance techniques that had emerged from Livia's network: systematic data collection, evidence-based policy-making, collaborative decision-making processes, and institutionalized mechanisms for innovation and adaptation. But they implemented these techniques within traditional Roman power structures, using them to make imperial authority more effective, rather than to create alternatives to it. Similarly, the educational and cultural institutions that the Flavians established throughout the empire adopted the intellectual methods and collaborative approaches that had made Livia's salon so productive, but they were designed to serve imperial purposes, rather than to develop independent intellectual traditions that might challenge imperial authority. It was a brilliant compromise that preserved the substance of Livia's innovations while eliminating their revolutionary implications. The Roman Empire of the late 1st century became more intelligent, more adaptive, and more effective than any previous imperial system, but it remained fundamentally imperial in its concentration of authority and its assumption that sophisticated governance required hierarchical control. But here's what Vespasian couldn't completely control. Ideas, once developed and demonstrated, have a tendency to evolve beyond their original applications. The intellectual traditions and social innovations that Livia had pioneered continued developing within the Flavian system, sometimes in ways that challenged the system's basic assumptions about power, authority, and social organization. The scholars and administrators trained in Livia's methods brought more than just technical skills to their imperial positions. They brought habits of critical thinking, collaborative problem-solving, and institutional innovation that gradually transformed Roman governance from within. The result was that by the end of the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire had become something unprecedented, a hierarchical imperial system that incorporated systematic mechanisms for self-criticism, adaptation, and improvement. It was like having a monarchy with built-in democratic feedback loops, an authoritarian system with institutionalized checks and balances. This hybrid approach proved remarkably successful for nearly 2 centuries, producing what historians called a Pax Romana, a period of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and cultural achievement throughout the Mediterranean world. But it also created tensions that would eventually prove unsustainable. The intellectual traditions that made Roman governance more effective also produced ideas that questioned whether imperial governance was the best possible approach to human organization. The collaborative methods that improved imperial administration also created networks of relationships that transcended imperial boundaries and loyalties. Most importantly, the innovations in education and intellectual development that the Flavians had embraced to strengthen imperial authority also produced populations that were increasingly capable of imagining and implementing alternatives to imperial authority. By the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire had become a victim of its own success. It had created the intellectual and institutional conditions for human advancement that would eventually make imperial systems obsolete. The same innovations that had allowed it to become the most sophisticated political system in human history were also generating the ideas and capabilities that would eventually render sophisticated political systems unnecessary. Livia had died in 72 AD, during the early years of Vespasian's reign, probably never fully understanding the long-term implications of what she had created. But her legacy was already transforming human civilization in ways that would not be fully understood for centuries. The revolution she had started with dinner parties and philosophical discussions had become something far more powerful than any military conquest or political transformation. It had become an irreversible advancement in human knowledge about how to organize societies for maximum benefit, minimum harm. And that advancement, once achieved, could never be completely suppressed or forgotten, no matter what happened to the political systems that had enabled it. Here's the thing about revolutions that succeed too well: they disappear into the fabric of civilization itself, becoming so fundamental to how we organize human society that we forget they were ever revolutionary at all. By 50 AD, the approaches to governance, education, and social organization that Livia had pioneered were so thoroughly integrated into Roman civilization that most people assumed they had always existed. The idea that systematic data collection should inform policy decisions seemed obvious. The notion that diverse perspectives improved problem-solving appeared self-evident. The principle that institutions should be designed to promote innovation while maintaining stability looked like basic common sense. But these ideas hadn't been obvious, self-evident, or commonsensical when Livia first developed them. They had been radical departures from traditional Roman approaches to power and authority. They had emerged from years of careful experimentation and systematic observation of what actually worked versus what was merely traditional. The intellectual methods, collaborative techniques, and institutional innovations that had made her salon more effective than official imperial institutions were now standard features of Roman administration throughout the empire. The approaches to education and cultural development that had emerged from her network were producing the most sophisticated populations in human history. Most importantly, the basic insight that had driven all of her work, that human intelligence, properly organized and systematically applied, could solve problems that had previously seemed intractable, had become the foundation of Roman civilization at its peak. But here's the irony. The very success of these innovations made their origins invisible. Because they worked so well and had become so thoroughly integrated into Roman society, people forgot that there had ever been alternatives. The chaos of Messalina's reign, the systematic authoritarianism of Agrippina's reforms, the artistic excess of Nero's experiments, all of it seemed like ancient history, evidence of primitive approaches to governance that sophisticated Romans had naturally evolved beyond. Livia herself had been largely forgotten, relegated to footnotes in histories that focused on emperors and senators, military campaigns, and political crises. The records of her salon had been absorbed into official archives where they were catalogued as administrative documents rather than revolutionary manifestos. Her intellectual colonies had been so successfully integrated into imperial administration that their origins as alternatives to imperial authority were no longer remembered. It was as if the internet had been so successfully integrated into modern life that people forgot there had ever been a time when instant global communication wasn't possible, or when accessing information required physically traveling to libraries and archives. But forgetting the revolutionary origins of successful innovations creates a dangerous vulnerability. It makes societies unable to recognize when those innovations are being threatened or undermined, because they can no longer imagine that alternatives are possible. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was facing challenges that its sophisticated administrative systems weren't designed to handle. Economic disruption from global climate change, military pressure from increasingly sophisticated barbarian confederations, and internal social tensions created by the empire's own success in developing populations that were too intelligent and too well educated to accept traditional justifications for imperial authority. The intellectual traditions and institutional innovations that had made Roman civilization so successful were now generating ideas and capabilities that challenged the assumptions on which Roman political authority was based. The collaborative methods that had improved imperial governance were creating networks of relationships that transcended imperial boundaries. The systematic approaches to problem-solving that had strengthened Roman administration were revealing fundamental flaws in the imperial system itself. But because Romans had forgotten the revolutionary origins of their most important innovations, they were unable to adapt those innovations to meet new challenges. They had inherited sophisticated tools for social organization and institutional design, but they had lost the understanding of how those tools worked and how they could be modified or improved. It was like inheriting a computer without understanding programming. You could use the existing software effectively, but you couldn't develop new applications when circumstances changed. The result was that Roman civilization began to stagnate, just when it most needed to innovate. The empire that had once been humanity's most advanced experiment in social organization became increasingly rigid, increasingly unable to adapt to changing circumstances, increasingly dependent on traditional approaches that were no longer adequate for the challenges it faced. The barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and political fragmentation that marked the end of the Western Roman Empire weren't just military and political failures. They were failures of imagination and intellectual adaptability. Rome fell because it had forgotten how to do what it had once done better than any civilization in history: systematically develop and implement better approaches to human organization and cooperation. But here's the thing about ideas that have been successfully integrated into human civilization. They don't disappear when the political systems that hosted them collapse. They get preserved, transmitted, and rediscovered by subsequent societies that face similar challenges. The intellectual traditions and institutional innovations that Livia had pioneered didn't die with the Roman Empire. They were preserved in the educational institutions that survived the collapse, transmitted through the networks of scholars and administrators who carried Roman knowledge into successor societies, and rediscovered by medieval and Renaissance thinkers who were grappling with similar problems of social organization and institutional design. Every time human societies rediscovered the importance of systematic observation, collaborative problem-solving, evidence-based decision-making, and institutional innovation, they were rediscovering principles that had first been systematically developed in a courtesan's villa on the Palatine Hill nearly 2,000 years earlier. Let that sink in for a moment. The woman whose name was scrubbed from most historical records, whose achievements were attributed to the emperors and senators she influenced, whose revolutionary innovations were so successfully integrated into human civilization that their origins were forgotten. This former slave girl from the margins of Roman society had fundamentally transformed how human beings organized themselves for mutual benefit. Every modern democracy that uses systematic data collection to inform policy decisions is using methods she pioneered. Every organization that brings together diverse perspectives to solve complex problems is applying principles she developed. Every institution designed to promote innovation while maintaining stability is built on foundations she helped establish. The collaborative techniques that make modern science possible, the evidence-based approaches that drive technological advancement, the institutional safeguards that prevent authoritarian excess, all of these can trace their intellectual lineage back to experiments first conducted in Livia's salon during the chaotic final years of the Roman Republic. But here's what makes her story truly extraordinary. She accomplished all of this without armies, without inherited authority, without official position, and without the traditional sources of power that shaped most historical achievements. She changed the world through intelligence, patience, and the systematic application of insights about human nature and social organization that were so profound they remained relevant for millennia after the civilization that produced them had collapsed. Think about what this means. A woman who started life as property, who lived in a society that considered her gender inherently inferior, who operated in a political system that gave her no official voice or legal standing. This woman developed innovations that became the foundation of modern civilization. She proved that intelligence, properly applied, could overcome any disadvantage of birth, circumstance, or social position. She demonstrated that systematic thinking and collaborative problem-solving could produce results that traditional approaches to power and authority couldn't match. She showed that human societies could be consciously designed and continuously improved, rather than simply inherited and endured. Most importantly, she established principles of social organization that remain the best available methods for creating societies that promote human flourishing while preventing the concentration of power that makes tyranny possible. But perhaps her greatest achievement was something even more fundamental. She proved that it was possible for human beings to consciously evolve beyond the social and political limitations that had constrained previous generations. The Rome she transformed wasn't just a more efficient version of previous empires. It was a fundamentally different kind of civilization, one that incorporated systematic mechanisms for learning, adaptation, and improvement. It was humanity's first attempt at creating a society that was designed to become more intelligent and more effective over time. That experiment was interrupted by the collapse of Roman political authority, but the principles it established continued to influence human development through every subsequent civilization that rediscovered the importance of systematic inquiry, collaborative problem-solving, and institutional innovation. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the development of democratic governance, the emergence of modern universities and research institutions, all of these represent rediscoveries and extensions of principles that Livia first systematically developed and demonstrated. We are still living in the world she helped create. Every time we use evidence to evaluate policies, every time we bring diverse perspectives together to solve complex problems, every time we design institutions to promote beneficial outcomes while preventing harmful ones, we are applying methods she pioneered. But we have also inherited the challenge she faced: how to continue advancing human knowledge and improving social organization while preventing the concentration of power that makes advancement impossible. The techniques she developed for building networks based on mutual benefit, rather than hierarchical control, for creating institutions that promote innovation while maintaining stability, for organizing societies that can adapt to new challenges while preserving valuable traditions. These remain the most promising approaches available for addressing the problems facing modern civilization: climate change, global inequality, technological disruption, political polarization. All of these challenges require exactly the kind of collaborative intelligence, systematic thinking, and institutional innovation that she pioneered. Her legacy isn't just historical, it's a blueprint for creating the kind of civilization that could successfully navigate the challenges of the 21st century and beyond. So here we are, 2,000 years later, still grappling with the same fundamental questions that drove Livia's work. How do we organize human societies to promote intelligence rather than ignorance, cooperation rather than conflict, innovation rather than stagnation? How do we create institutions that serve human flourishing rather than merely preserving existing power structures? How do we ensure that knowledge and capability are used for beneficial purposes rather than destructive ones? The woman who started as a slave and became the architect of modern civilization never got to see the full implications of what she had created. She died during the early years of the Pax Romana, probably satisfied that her innovations had helped create a more stable and effective empire, but almost certainly unaware that she had actually designed the intellectual and institutional foundations for human advancement itself. But her work continues in every laboratory where diverse teams collaborate to solve complex problems, in every democracy where evidence-based policymaking improves citizens' lives, in every institution designed to promote learning and adaptation over time. More importantly, her example continues to inspire anyone who believes that human intelligence, systematically applied and collaboratively organized, can overcome seemingly impossible challenges and create better futures than anyone thought possible. The techniques she developed for building influence through demonstrated competence, rather than inherited authority, remain relevant for anyone trying to create positive change in resistant systems. Her methods for organizing diverse groups around shared purposes, while respecting individual differences, continue to be the most effective approaches for complex problem solving. Her insights about institutional design and social organization remain the best available guidance for creating sustainable improvements in human welfare. But perhaps most importantly, her story demonstrates something that every generation needs to rediscover: that the limitations and problems that seem permanent and unchangeable in any given society are actually choices that can be consciously altered by people who understand how systems work and are willing to do the patient, systematic work required to improve them. The Roman Empire seemed permanent and unchangeable to the people living under it, just as our current systems seem permanent and unchangeable to us. But Livia proved that intelligent, persistent effort could transform even the most rigid and traditional societies into something more effective, more humane, and more aligned with human potential. She also proved that such transformations don't require violence, revolution, or the destruction of existing institutions. They require better ideas, implemented systematically and demonstrated convincingly until they become the new normal. The woman who shamed Messalina, outmaneuvered Agrippina, and redirected the trajectory of Roman civilization wasn't seeking to destroy the empire. She was trying to help it become the best possible version of itself. Her goal wasn't to eliminate Roman power, but to ensure that Roman power was exercised more intelligently and more effectively. That's a model that remains relevant for anyone trying to improve institutions, organizations, or societies that are powerful enough to do great good or great harm, depending on how they're guided. The revolution she started, the systematic application of human intelligence to the problems of social organization and institutional design, is the same revolution that continues to drive human progress in every field, from medicine to environmental science to space exploration. Every breakthrough in human knowledge and capability represents an extension of the principles she established, that systematic inquiry and collaborative problem-solving can produce results that were previously thought impossible. And every institution that successfully promotes human flourishing while preventing the concentration of power represents an application of the organizational innovations she pioneered. Her legacy isn't preserved in monuments or historical records. It's embedded in the methods we use to solve problems, the institutions we create to serve human needs, and the principles we apply when we want to make the world better than we found it. The Courtesan who challenged an empire and won didn't just change Roman history, she changed the trajectory of human civilization itself. And that revolution continues every time someone decides that intelligence and collaboration can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Every time someone chooses systematic thinking over traditional assumptions. Every time someone builds institutions designed to serve human flourishing rather than merely preserving existing power. In a world facing unprecedented challenges and possibilities, we could do worse than remember the example of a forgotten woman who proved that human intelligence, properly applied, can transform anything, even empires that seem too powerful to change. The revolution continues. The question is whether we'll be intelligent and courageous enough to continue it. Still think one person can't change the world? Maybe you just haven't found the right dinner party to start with. History is full of forgotten revolutionaries who changed everything using nothing but intelligence and patience. The question isn't whether change is possible, it's whether you're ready to do the systematic work required to make it happen. Subscribe if you're ready to discover more stories about people who proved that the impossible is just another word for not yet accomplished.